So if you're like me, you've probably watched a ton of review videos on the Sony ZV-1, and you've heard the same common complaint throughout. The 24mm lens that's built in this camera, which is actually 25.5mm, which then crops to 30mm when you have digital stabilization enabled, is too short or too long of lens for vlogging. And the way I want to try to fix it is by attaching a wide angle converter to the front of the ZV-1. So when I was researching what wide angle converter to buy, I actually came up with a really interesting option made by Panasonic. So Panasonic had a point and shoot camera called the LX5, and they made a wide angle converter specifically for that point and shoot camera. And this really intrigued me because I felt like the optical formula would be relatively similar. Just like the ZV-1, the LX5 was a 24mm full frame equivalent, although that sensor was actually smaller than the 1-inch sensor that's in the ZV-1. But the fact that it worked out to be about 24mm full frame equivalent made me think that we were in the right ballpark. It was also a relatively fast lens. I think it maxed out at around f2. So again, similar to the f1.8 that's on the ZV-1. And the name of the wide angle converter is the Panasonic DMW LWA52. And I was able to pick one of these up off of eBay. So you can see how this thing would look when it's attached. So then how do we get it attached? Well, there's a 52mm filter thread on the back of the wide angle converter. So in order to actually be able to mount it to the ZV-1, you need to use a kit that adds a little filter thread to this front lens. And there's a company called Lensmate that makes a kit for the Sony RX100 5A. And since the lens that's in the ZV-1 is pretty much the same that's in the RX100 5A, I figure this should work. It turns out that this little ring here that you use to it's sort of like a guide in order to easily be able to mount the adhesive filter thread bayonet thing. You'll see as we get more into it. It doesn't fit on the ZV-1. So we're not gonna be able to use this guide in order to set our adhesive. We're gonna need to be able to do that by hand. All right, that seems like it's pretty good. We'll push pretty firmly all the way around. I don't know if I could show you this, but doing it without the guide, I kind of messed up a little bit. On this edge here, it's not supposed to be flush. So on the one side I was looking at, I lined it up flush, but then that meant that on the far side, it's actually hanging off a little bit too much. So it's not perfectly centered. It seems like it should have just hung off all the way around just a tiny little bit, but I think it will work. And if we take the 52mm adapter and we attach the 52mm side to our wide angle converter, and then we take that over to the camera, you can see that just with a quick twist, the wide angle lens converter locks into place just like that. And it seems, it's definitely a lot heavier. Probably wouldn't want to turn the camera on and off while this is attached because it might put too much stress on the motor. But, if you support it from the lens or from this wide angle adapter while you're doing some vlogging, I kind of think it would be okay. When we're done using the wide angle adapter, it just clicks off and we're left with just this tiny little bayonet on the front. All right, so I want to take this thing out, do some vlogging tests, check out the different angle of view, and also take some pictures and see how much degradation in image quality we have when we're using this adapter versus when we're not. All right, here we are up on the Sony ZV-1. This is without the lens converter attached, so we're at like 24mm full frame equivalent. Of course, we have the digital image stabilization on, so that crops it to more like maybe 30mm full frame equivalent. And we're just using the built-in microphone with the wind muff, so hopefully you're not getting any of that wind noise. You can see how the audio in camera sounds. Right now we're at 4K, 1/50th shutter speed, shooting at about it's changing between f4 and f6. We're in aperture priority mode, so as I move in and out of the shadows. Okay, now we have the wide angle converter attached, so it's taking that 30mm full frame equivalent that we had with the digital image stabilization and bringing it down to maybe like 22mm full frame equivalent, so you can obviously see much more of the background as I'm walking here. It's, I think, a huge improvement. Now the question is, how does this impact the digital image stabilization? Are you seeing some warpy stuff in the corners? Obviously, this lens or this focal length isn't something that this camera was designed to work with when it was doing its digital image stabilization. And then of course the other thing to look for is how is the image quality? Hopefully I'm pretty sharp here, I'm in the center of the image, but if we're shooting at f6.3, so if there is some fall off in the corners in terms of sharpness, I'm not sure you'd be able to tell. I'll show you a couple of photos here in a minute that I took so we can pixel peep on the corners and see if there really is any image loss. But from what I can tell on the screen here, it's actually looking really good. It seems like I'm nice and sharp in the middle, and I'm loving this extra field of view just from the little monitor here. It seems like this is a dramatic improvement over the almost 30mm full frame equivalent that you get on the Sony ZV-1 when you're using the digital image stabilization. All right, let's give it one more look. Let's go ahead and remove the wide angle adapter so you can kind of compare again, and you can see how well this wide angle adapter is handling the sun being directly behind us versus the native lens. So there it is without the wide angle adapter. How much better is it able to handle the sun being directly behind us? Any less ghosting than we had when we had the wide angle adapter attached? I'll add the wide angle adapter one more time. All right, so now we're back on with the wide angle adapter. Yeah, let me know your thoughts. So I just reviewed that footage on a 4K monitor, and you know what? It looked really good. Like in the center of the frame where I was in focus, it looked really sharp. The colors looked good. The stabilization looked good. I was impressed that there wasn't any kind of weird warpy stuff in the corners. That was the first time I've used the in-camera audio. I thought the audio sounded good. It was kind of a really windy day, and this wind muff did an excellent job. I think only at one point in the clip could I hear any wind noise at all. And it's just so nice to not have to like rig up an external microphone with a dead cat if you just want to like grab some clips. And, you know, even though this lens adapter is heavier than, you know, makes the camera quite a bit heavier than it would be otherwise, if you think about without this adapter, if you wanted to achieve a similar field of view, you'd have to bring like some kind of selfie stick with you. And I think this adapter, you can just pop right off, throw a lens cap on it, put it in your pocket. You know, it's definitely a more compact solution to get an improved field of view. Of course, the one downside to this adapter is there's no filter thread on the front, which means you can't attach even more ND. You're kind of stuck with the 3 stops of ND that are built into the camera. But that seems to be okay unless you're shooting in something like S-Log that bumps up your minimum ISO. I was able to shoot at 1/50th of a second shutter speed using the 3 stops of ND on the relatively sunny days you saw in those clips. And I think my f-stop never really got higher than maybe 6.3. So I think there's enough ND in this camera where you really don't need that external ND unless you absolutely always want to be shooting at f1.8. Now I said that I thought the image for shooting video looked really good, but let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of still images and pixel peep the corners and see if the image quality really is as good as it seemed from those vlogging clips. So I took a few pictures of this tree, first without the adapter at both f1.8 and then at f8, and then I moved in with the adapter attached to achieve a sort of a similar composition to basically fill the frame with the tree, and then shot with the adapter at f1.8 and at f8. And in this first comparison we're looking at here, it's at f1.8. Over on the left, we have the image without the adapter, and on the right, we have the image with the adapter. And you can see that at f1.8, the corners using the adapter are hot trash. In fact, I'm surprised how good the vlog footage looked, given how terrible these corners look here. However, the center looks really sharp, and you have to remember when you're shooting a 16:9 frame for video and then throwing a 20% crop on top using digital image stabilization, you're cutting out sort of the worst of that image. But at f8, things actually start to look incredible, even in the corners. I can't really tell much of a difference between the image with and without the adapter, and the way I was using the camera in that vlog example in aperture priority mode meant I was up at a higher f-stop most of the time, and then anytime you drop down to a lower f-stop, if you're vlogging and you're in the center of the frame, then it's going to be kind of a blurry background around the sides anyway. So after I recorded all that other footage using the Panasonic wide angle adapter, I actually had another wide angle converter show up in the mail, and I was able to pick this up off eBay for only $15 with free shipping. So it seemed like an interesting second point of comparison. So if we open this guy up, it feels a lot lighter than the Panasonic. I think like it's mostly plastic. It's definitely thinner. I mean, you can compare kind of the two here, but it is a little bit bigger around, but it's so much lighter. Either like the glass elements aren't as dense or as thick, or there's just a lot more plastic in the build. You know, this Panasonic was about 10 times more expensive than this Sony handycam converter from the late 90s. Is it worth paying more to get something like the Panasonic converter? I don't know. Let's take this guy outside and find out. Okay, so here we are with the Sony handycam from 25 years ago, wide angle converter mounted to the Sony ZV-1. Remember, this is a 0.6 wide angle magnification. So taking our 30mm full frame equivalent when we have digital image stabilization enabled should bring us to about 18mm full frame equivalent, which is a great focal length for vlogging. And because it's so cheap, like I'm not really worried about it falling off the front of the ZV-1 and then breaking. But the question is, how is the image quality? I can kind of already tell there's more distortion in the background, but as long as like the image is sharp,
then maybe that's okay. Maybe it's not worth paying more money to get the Panasonic version. All right, let's go ahead and pop this thing off so you can compare the image quality with the native lens that just comes stock with the ZV-1. And there it is. Obviously the angle of view is much narrower. We went from like an 18mm full frame equivalent to a 30mm full frame equivalent. But the real question is, how did the image quality change?
So that footage was interesting. I mean, you could tell right away there was a ton more distortion. Even in the center of the image, like my face was totally distorted. It was definitely kind of wonky looking. But, you know, I think it was also relatively sharp, at least in the center. And if you were watching this video on a cell phone, then you might have come away relatively impressed. But the real issue for me was how that distortion sort of messed with the digital image stabilization in the camera. I watched that clip back on a 27-inch 4K monitor in full screen, and to be honest, it actually kind of gave me a little bit of motion sickness. It was just like weird warpy stuff all over the frame. And while the 18mm field of view that the Sony provided was nice, I actually think I kind of preferred the field of view that's like 22mm-ish that you got on this Panasonic. And then I'm not even going to bother testing this with stills because you could already tell that the image quality was worse. All right, final thoughts time. Well, so far, you know, this Lensmate adapter that I attached here, the adhesive seems to be holding fine. I do wish that Sony would have just like added a filter thread to the base of the ZV-1. On the LX5, you can actually unscrew the base of the sort of lens mount, and then that reveals a thread, and then you take this tube attachment that sells separately from this wide angle converter, and that screws into that, and you end up with this metal tube that sticks out from the front of the camera and surrounds and sort of encases the lens. And then on the end of that tube is the 52mm filter thread where you can screw on like your ND filters or like a heavy wide angle adapter like this. And then I found these photos from a user on DP Review that show what the final product looked like with the wide angle adapter attached. And you have to admit, that is a really clean looking setup. If Sony released some kind of first party accessory like that, I would be all over it. Maybe a company like Small Rig, who already has a cage on pre-order for the ZV-1, could add like a filter thread to the base of the cage. You can see how there's kind of like a lens collar that's part of that cage. You could totally just have, I don't know what the dimensions would be, maybe like a 67mm filter thread on the end of that. And then if Small Rig just sold an optional tube that would sort of encase the lens itself, then you could provide a really secure threaded connection to the end of that tube. So Small Rig, if you're listening, that would be awesome. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you've tried another wide angle adapter with either the RX100 or with the new ZV-1, definitely leave me a comment down below letting me know how it worked out. I'm definitely interested in hearing what kind of results people are getting with the other wide angle lens adapters that are out there. Well, if you made it this far, again, I appreciate you watching. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.